Silence between an adult child and a parent is almost always misunderstood. Families call it ingratitude, parents feel rejected, and outsiders assume the child has simply forgotten where they came from. But psychology offers a very different explanation, one that has far less to do with selfishness and far more to do with survival. Many adult children create distance not because they don't care, but because being close activates a nervous system that has been on duty since childhood. For them, distance is not abandonment. It is the first real rest they have ever experienced. Research into family systems shows that children who were given too much responsibility early in life often grow into adults who need the most space. These are the children who became the emotional anchors in their families, the ones who solved problems, calmed tensions, and kept everything functioning. Instead of being supported, they learned to support everyone else, and while this can look like strength or maturity from the outside, it often creates a kind of exhaustion that doesn't disappear with time. It stays in the body, in the mind, and in the way they respond to relationships even decades later. Psychologists call this pattern parentification, a role reversal where a child takes on responsibilities that belong to an adult. Sometimes it is practical, like cooking, managing siblings, or handling household tasks. Other times it is emotional, where the child becomes the one who listens to a parent's problems, manages their moods, and carries emotional burdens they were never meant to hold. Over time, this teaches the child something powerful but damaging, that their value comes from being useful, not from simply being themselves. They become highly sensitive to other people's needs while slowly losing connection with their own feelings, desires, and limits. As they grow into adults, this creates a quiet internal conflict. They may love their parents deeply, but at the same time, they feel an overwhelming need to step back. Even something as simple as a phone call can reactivate the old role. The tone of a parent's voice, the familiar patterns in conversation, or even just the history between them can trigger a return to that same position of responsibility. Suddenly, they are no longer an independent adult. They are the child again, scanning for emotional signals, preparing to respond, and unconsciously putting their own needs aside. So sometimes they let the phone ring. Not because they don't care, but because answering it feels like stepping back into a version of themselves they worked very hard to leave behind. This is often misunderstood as avoidance, but in reality, it is a boundary. And for many people who grew up in these roles, it may be the first real boundary they have ever been able to create. Studies on attachment show that individuals who experience this kind of childhood often develop conflicting impulses toward their parents. They feel a genuine desire for connection, but at the same time, they experience a deep, almost physical resistance to it. The body remembers patterns that the mind may try to forgive or rationalize. From the outside, this can look confusing or even hurtful, but from the inside, it is a constant balancing act between love and self-preservation. What makes this dynamic even more complicated is that parentification is often rewarded. These children are praised for being responsible, dependable, and mature beyond their years. That praise becomes meaningful because it fills a gap where emotional support might be missing. But over time, it teaches them that love and approval are conditional. They learn that they are valued for what they do, not for who they are. So they keep performing, even when it costs them their energy, their identity, and their sense of peace. As adults, this can show up in subtle but powerful ways. Many struggle with people-pleasing, constantly putting others first while ignoring their own needs. Others feel a persistent sense of vigilance, as if they are always on watch, even in safe environments. Relaxation can feel unfamiliar, and rest can feel undeserved. And when they finally begin to step back, to create space, or to say no, it often feels uncomfortable at first, not because it is wrong, but because it is new. The distance they create from their parents is not an act of punishment or rejection. It is a form of regulation. It is their way of learning that they are allowed to exist without constantly managing someone else's emotions. It is their way of rediscovering who they are outside of the role they were assigned. This doesn't mean they don't love their parents. In fact, in many cases, the love is still very much there. But it exists alongside an understanding that closeness, at least in its old form, comes at a cost they can no longer afford to pay. Over time, this distance may change. Some relationships become healthier as boundaries are respected and new patterns are built. Others remain distant, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Either way, the distance itself is not the problem. It is information. It tells a story about what the child experienced, what they needed, and what they are still learning to give themselves. For parents, understanding this can be difficult, especially if they believe they did their best, provided stability, and worked hard to care for their family. And all of that can be true. But emotional attunement, The ability to see and respond to a child's inner world is just as important as providing for their physical needs. Without it, a child may grow up feeling responsible for everything around them while remaining disconnected from themselves. And that disconnection takes time, awareness, and often distance to heal. For the adult child, learning to create that distance can be one of the most challenging and important steps they take. It requires unlearning patterns that were reinforced for years. It requires accepting that they are allowed to prioritize their own well being, even if it is misunderstood by others. And it requires recognizing that rest is not something they have to earn by doing more. Sometimes, the most radical act of self care is simply stepping back, even if it means letting the phone ring one more time before picking it up. Not because they don't care, but because they are finally learning that they matter too. The silence that exists between them and their parents is not empty. It is filled with the work of healing, the rebuilding of identity, and the slow process of becoming someone who no longer defines themselves by how much they can carry for others. In a world that often values constant availability and endless giving, choosing distance can feel like going against the norm. But for those who have spent a lifetime carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with, it is not just a choice, it is a necessity. And over time, that space can become something else entirely. Not a sign of disconnection, but a foundation for a healthier, more balanced relationship, both with others and with themselves. Because in the end, the distance is not the wound. The distance is the first clear sign that healing has already begun.